Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the second webinar of the Regional Energy Learning Alliance, which is a network bringing together people that are researching and working in the field of community energy broadly, but also with a focus on East Africa. So my name is Lorraine Howe, and I'm a researcher at the Centre for Research on Governance and Development based in Mozambique. And we're one of 12 partners that are working together on this 3-year research project that's looking at the role that community energy systems can play in advancing just and sustainable energy transitions. And we're specifically looking at Ethiopia, Malawi, and Mozambique. So today we're extremely delighted to be joined by Professor Benjamin Sovacool, who is a Professor of Energy Policy at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex Business School, and the Director of the Centre on Innovation and Energy Demand and of the Sussex Energy Group. As I'm sure many of you that have joined today know, Ben has written and published extensively on the topics of global energy policy and politics, energy security and energy justice. He is also a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th Assessment Report, which is due to be published next year, and an advisor on energy to the European Commission's Directorate General for Innovation and Research. So we're extremely pleased that Ben is able to join us today, and he's going to be presenting on the topic of rethinking energy policy, poverty, and best practices for the governance of distributed renewable energy access. So following Ben's presentation, we will have a short discussant response from Dr. Joshua Kirshner, who's a senior lecturer in the Department of Environment and Geography at the University of York. And after Josh's comments, we'll open the floor for a question and answer session, which I hope will be as vibrant as our first webinar. So I very much encourage you during the presentations to think of any questions that you would like to ask our presenters. So before I hand over to Ben, I just want to make 2 short housekeeping announcements. So firstly, the presentation will be recorded so that we can upload it to the website for those not able to join us today. And as I think I saw someone ask in one of the comments already, in case you missed our first webinar, which was a fascinating presentation by Professor Jacob Mulugeta on community energy in East Africa, you can go to our website and access the recording there. So perhaps we can paste the web link for where you can find those in the chat here for those interested. And secondly, if you do have a question that you want to ask today, if you could write it in the chat function that you should see on your screen, there should be a little sign on the right hand side for you to see the speech bubble to enter your questions. Then we will attempt to get to as many as we can after the presentations. So unless there's anything else I've forgotten, which Vicky or Vanessa may remind me, it's my pleasure to hand over to Professor Sovacool to begin his presentation. So Ben, over to you.
Thank you, and I presume this is, of course, how all of these start. You can see my slides, I hope.
Yes, I can certainly see them.
Thank you, perfect. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's also really nice to be giving a talk on this topic, because this was actually a research project intending to promote learning and impact policy, especially in places like the Global South. And even though the focus here is on Asia, the Asia Pacific, I do think a lot of the lessons are transferable to kind of sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, we chose Asia because at the time of the study, there were more people suffering from energy poverty in Asia than in Africa, especially due to the population density of the Indian subcontinent. So India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, I think still consume less energy per capita than all of Africa. So I thought I would start with some very high-level statistics. Hopefully they'll dazzle you a little bit. These are actually from 2021, even though it's reflecting 2018 data. This is from the International Energy Agency's Energy Access Database. Very easy to find. Type in energy access and the IEA, and these come up. And I'm still amazed. I should correct this, even though it's 2021. And I'm just thinking back to, books like Arthur Clarke's 2001: A Space Odyssey. Felt like by the year 2000, we'd already have colonies on the moon. So even though we are well into the future, we still have hundreds of millions of people who do not have reliable access to electricity networks. which means that they have lifestyles that are totally unlike those that we're accustomed to. No Zooms, no MP3s, maybe even no mobile phones, no hot showers, and no cold beers. And it's one thing to see the numbers here on a map. It's quite another to kind of view them. You know, the problem of energy poverty can even be viewed from outer space, because you can use streetlights as a proxy for electrification, and you can literally see how dark most of the continent of Africa is, as well as very large pockets of Central Asia, and of course Australia, but that's because no one lives in Australia. The other element that people often discuss energy poverty into is cooking. And here you can see the numbers are actually even worse. It's not hundreds of millions, it's billions. It is almost 3 billion people around the world still cook without improved cook stoves over open fires or hearths. They use the same technology that existed in the time of Jesus Christ, which is more than 2,000 years ago. And again, it's one thing to see it on a map. And again, note that most of these countries are in the global south. It's quite another to actually see this man, who is a fuel wood seller in Sri Lanka. And you know, it's an arduous task of he is chopping and hauling and collecting wood. And many times it's actually women, not men, who are doing these sorts of tasks. And he works for 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, doing back-breaking labor. And he's not even sitting in a chair. And I think he only has one hatchet, not even like he's using mechanical tools when he collects and processes the fuel wood. You can also kind of view the global energy access problem with diagrams like this that just kind of show you the equity and justice implications. And so I always ask my students, is it fair that the 20 million people of New York consume roughly the same amount of energy per capita than the 800 million people in sub-Saharan Africa? Is this a system that Rawls would say is socially just, or is it one that is only perpetuating inequity and asymmetries in access? And I think it would be remiss if we also didn't talk about some of the gendered implications of this energy access, to the point where one of the most dangerous things a woman can do is actually cook in her kitchen. It's not work some dangerous job. It's not drink alcohol. It's not go out late at night into an unsafe part of town. The killer is in her kitchen. And that means it's also affecting her children. And if you take these projections from the World Health Organization, you can see that literally 4 million people, that's roughly the size of Denmark, die every year because of the way that they cook. It is more deaths, premature deaths, than malaria and tuberculosis, and it's more deaths than malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS combined if we look at projections for 2030, because we're intending to make significant progress on fighting those diseases. And what's really tragic about these numbers, it's 11 deaths a minute. So in the minute I've been speaking, 11 more people have died. 80% of these deaths are in women and children under the age of 5. So it's not like some elderly person who's tragically passing away a few weeks earlier than they would have. This is robbing people of their lives in the prime of their life, or when their life is actually just beginning. And you can see how interesting the gender dynamics get in graphs like this. This comes from Harvard, where you're looking at, if you see the line on the bottom shows you as you increase the amount of biomass, as you increase solid fuels for cooking, i.e. as you increase people who cook with old technology, look at how much the infant mortality rates jump, look at how much the birth rates go up because people are having more children, perhaps to compensate for life expectancy issues, and also look how much female life expectancy and overall life expectancy decline. So it really underscores the magnanimous health impacts that occur as you depend on solid fuels for cooking. And health is just one aspect. There are lots of other gendered aspects as well. This looks at Tanzania, where it just looks at the amount of time and the amount of work that women do compared to men. And on the left, you can see, I think the left is the actual kilograms. No, on the left is hours, and on the right is kilograms carried. So women are working 5 times more doing these tasks than men, and they're carrying up to 8 times per year. Kirk Smith used to say, who passed away a few years ago, and he did excellent work on energy access, that kind of wood and biomass and cooking this way is the fuel that warms 4 times. And he did not mean this in a positive way. He meant this as in it warms you the first time when you're collecting the fuel wood, usually through strenuous exercise and you're sweating and maybe getting injured. It warms the second time when you're combusting it. It warms a third time when you fall sick with fever or disease, and it warms the fourth time by contributing to climate change, not just through carbon emissions, but also things like aerosols and black carbon. So it is one of these energy sources that actually does 4 times the damage, not just 1 time the damage. So with these really, really stark problems, right? Poverty, deprivation, health, gender inequality, we undertook about 10 years ago a research project that really wanted to ask how we solve this wicked problem. When you think about energy access programs, what works and what doesn't work, what are best practices, what are worst practices, what have we learned, what could be scaled up? And this just shows you actually one of our case studies. This is a solar Mongolia herder near Ulaanbaatar. So what we ended up doing, and I won't bore you with too many of the details, is we spent months at that time looking across all of the Asia Pacific. Had to be Asia because that was our funder, but also, as I said, at that time, the Asia Pacific had higher rates of energy poverty than sub-Saharan Africa. So we spent months where we looked at 1,156 possible case studies. And then we started the arduous process of scaling them down, because that's just too many. So we did an 8-phase selection process where we rooted out those that weren't in middle income or lower middle income countries. So we didn't want any rich countries. We ruled out those that didn't look at renewable energy. So even though some things like LPG gas can be used, for our project, we didn't really look at those. We only looked at solar home systems, biomass stoves, biogas digesters, microhydro dams, and small-scale wind. Also means no lighting programs, no mobile phone programs that might have a nexus with energy programs. We wanted programs that had sufficient scale, so they had to have operated at least for a few years. That was getting rid of all the pilot projects or the demonstration projects, which come and go. We wanted them to operate in off-grid areas or rural areas, so we didn't want anything in urban areas or in centralized configurations. We wanted them then that had at least a significant budget. We didn't want some project that was $10,000. So we excluded those that were less than $50,000 or had less than hundreds of customers or less in terms of capacity. And actually, we ended up getting quite large projects, as I'll show you in a moment. Most of our projects actually were multi-million-dollar projects, and one was a multi-billion-dollar project. And then at that time, we wanted them to be recent. So we got rid of projects that were too old. And then finally, and maybe most selectively, we wanted cases that had sufficient data and that were clear-cut examples of success or failure. And by success, we mean a project that met all of its targets on time or ahead of time, at cost or below cost. And believe it or not, we did find successes. And a failure meant spent all of the money, met almost none of the targets, and was behind. And again, we almost, surprisingly perhaps, we had no difficulty finding lots of failures as well. And the 10 final projects are here. The top 6 ones are the so-called successes: Bangladesh, China, Laos, Mongolia, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and India. Sorry, not India. The bottom 4 are the failures: India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea. And those of you that may know me or read my work know I am a qualitative social scientist. While some of our work does do models and quantitative stuff, really I've been trained in a kind of qualitative interviews. So we undertook a ton of research interviews related to these 10 projects, 441 to be precise, at almost 200 institutions. And this was all original field research, which meant either myself or the research team visited all of these locations. And we wanted to make sure we got really rich, broad perspectives. So we solicited those not just from governments and energy ministries, but also intergovernmental organizations like the GEF or the World Bank, civil society groups like SEI or Friends of the Earth, local groups, very important local civil society groups like Grameen Shakti in Bangladesh or YP in Indonesia. Definitely electricity suppliers, whether they're state-linked or privatized, like the Ceylon Electricity Board in Sri Lanka or PNG Power Limited. Manufacturers and industry groups. This includes big ones like Alstom Hydro and Siemens, and then small ones, I love these names, like Barefoot Power or Sunlabob. And then we also wanted to get into financiers. So we, GTZ, USAID, the ADB, and the IFC and IDRA of the World Bank Group. And then finally, to round it out, universities and independent research institutes like the Chinese Academy of Sciences or different universities. As if that wasn't enough, and we think we had 10 million words of transcribed interview text because some of these interviews took a long time. We wanted to use a mixed methods research design. This improves what's known as triangulation and also rigor. So we supplemented all those interviews with a huge number of site visits. So here you can see me, that's me on the right back when I had hair, near the base of Mount Everest, Lukla, where they had a small microhydro dam. And on the bottom left, you can see a solar manufacturing facility, assembly line in Qingdao, China. We did 90 of these visits. I don't even want to think about our carbon footprint. Maybe it was in a good cause, because we did visit, all of these different systems and different configurations, whether it's building integrated solar, off-grid solar, or kind of, standalone solar or solar lighting. Or maybe it was microhydro, small hydro, pico hydro. We visited some of the research laboratories that were piloting the technology. We visited the testing and validation centers that were standardizing the technology. We visited the factories that were making the technology, including the assembly lines where we saw cookstoves being made or solar PV being put together. And we wanted to also include a mix of public and private actors. Our final leg of the research methods is a staggering number of interviews with community members, either the focus groups or household surveys. This was not just women and children. We also talked to tribal leaders, village leaders, mayors, and other political leaders. We talked to members of the local parliament, as well as members of the national parliament. And then we triangulated all of that with another in-depth literature review specific to that country, and also especially of project documents. One of the upsides to World Bank projects is they generate a lot of paperwork. PIPs, POPs, pre-implementation project reports, post-project implementation reports, and a whole slew of other monitoring and evaluation meant that some of the projects that we looked at had 100 sources of evidence. So it was quite good to get us kind of input into how those projects were structured. Okay, so with the really exciting research methods slides behind us, what did we find? And I'm only going to focus here. I could talk for an hour about this. I won't. I'm only going to focus on a small handful of core findings. And the first one is there is no one-size-fits-all technology to solve the energy access problem. Right? It's not like the answer is just wind or solar home systems or picogrids. It really does depend on a complexity of bundled technologies or a portfolio of energy services. And this is very well illustrated here. This is a diagram from Bangladesh, one of our cases. And it just shows you the complexity of how households meet their energy demand, not moving up or down an energy ladder, but crisscrossing across multiple dimensions based on price, familiarity, availability, even seasonal changes, where they will use multiple energy sources. They may stockpile energy sources. They may sell energy sources to other family members or rent out things like lights. So it really does underscore how complex the household energy decision-making environment is. And this shows it for Bangladesh. This also shows you another one looking at electrification. I think this is in the Philippines, where you can see the different things that electricity does and all of the outcomes that it can lead as it relates to things as diverse as food preservation or comfort and water filtration or lighting for extended studying hours, which then have positive knock-on effects on things like education or income or health. And again, the diversity of those arrows indicates the complexity of those decision-making processes. And I think you start to see in our cases how different technologies come to be adopted by very different groups. So again, there's no single technology that dominates the market. You see things like these. This is a solar cooker being used mostly at tea houses and areas that you might need hot water. So this technology tends to be used either by poor rural women or by restaurants and vendors. Whereas this biogas digester in Bangladesh is used by middle to upper income families because you have to have lots of cattle or poultry. I think this family had 10 livestock and 25 chickens. Also note it's a fixed dome concrete digester, which means it's not mobile. So this rules out herders and nomadic markets. And also it means you have to own your property. because you're not going to build one of these on a property that you rent. So already you're starting to see it's landowners and kind of wealthier parts of Bangladeshi society who can afford the capital expense and the land requirements for a biogas digester. Conversely, this is a solar home system in China. Is a very cheap, affordable, modular, and scalable technology. This technology here cost about $1,000. This one costs about $100. So it's 10 times as cheap. But of course, it's not providing as much energy. This system here, I think, was sized around 20 kilowatts. So it's providing a very significant amount of energy and or cooking fuel. This one here is 10 watts. Watts, not even kilowatts. 10-watt peak system, good enough for 2 lights and maybe a mobile phone. But it has the benefit of everything you see here can fit onto that motorcycle. So everything can be packed up as this herder and his child traverse around the kind of rural mountainsides near Tibet. Whereas this shows you the microhydro facility that I was in front of in one of the earlier photos in Nepal. This is a 25 kilowatt system that costs about $40,000. So here, it's not even a system that an individual can afford. It's cooperatives, or it's community groups, or it's a neighborhood that bands together to raise money to pay for the facility. It also requires maintenance and labor fees of about $2,000 to $3,000 a year, whereas, of course, this has no maintenance fees. Well, relatively very little maintenance fees. So again, a very different financial dynamic and community cooperative dynamic behind microhydro. Small-scale wind turbines were not used extensively throughout our cases, but they did show up in 2. And here it tended to be actually entrepreneurs and innovators who just liked being kind of geeky. Then were really using it for essential energy services. It was more to say that they kind of had wind and they were kind of neat and cool. So it was kind of like a boutique sort of energy innovation that still hasn't really taken off in most parts of the world, whereas solar home systems and biogas digesters have. So this is kind of the niche innovation for the innovative entrepreneur. And then finally, the most broad technology, the one that had the most mass market appeal, is the cook stove. This is a 2-mouthed concrete cook stove being made by Grameen Shakti in Bangladesh. You also have 1-mouth, 3-mouth, and 4-mouth versions. This one here costs only $8, and you can install it in 2 hours. So it really underscores the kind of, it's the cheapest of the options. And because almost everyone needs to cook, it's also the option that is most available at the bottom of the pyramid. This is a multi-billion person market for these types of technologies, right? 2.7 billion, if you remember the numbers from earlier. And again, it's a technology that once it's installed, it's very easy to use. You just cook over it, usually like you cooked over what you're replacing, although the cooking times and kind of fuels used will change. And what you can do is you can kind of plot all these different options. We did it here with support from the United Nations Development Program, where we created what's been called the Energy Access Cost Curve. And we chose Vanuatu because it was easy to do. And look, we didn't hire McKinsey & Company to do our abatement curve. We did it ourselves with an Excel sheet. And so that meant we chose Vanuatu because it was only 20 megawatts, pretty small grid. And look how high the price of grid electricity is, 60 cents, because they rely mostly on diesel imports. And again, this really underscores what I said earlier about there not being a single option. Everything below that yellow dotted line will provide energy services below the current cost of the grid. So it is cost competitive. Everything above the line costs a little bit more, but the argument is you could maybe use the savings from those below the line to fund those above the line, and everyone gets a net zero cost energy access program. The other thing that's quite neat is the width of these different options varies. Improved cook stoves and I think community microgrids have the most potential. Others like microhydro or diesel, less so. The final thing that's quite neat about it is it really shows you the role of all 3 different types of options, right? The kind of blue options are kind of energy efficiency ones, like lighting and cooking. The red ones are renewables, and the black ones are fossil fuels. Even fossil fuels have a role to play. Kerosene, maybe grid extension, maybe batteries, in helping alleviate energy poverty. And many of the communities we spoke with didn't care whether it was renewable or not. They just cared about it being reliable, high-quality energy access. If Vanuatu had proceeded to implement this cost curve, they would have had universal energy access in 5 years. So it also gives you a nice blueprint of how to prioritize different investments. Okay, So that was the first finding. Most countries will have energy access cost curves like this. They'll look different, of course. But the idea is there will be a hierarchy of options, and there'll probably be dozens of options available in each of those markets that all provide different types of energy services at different costs. Second conclusion, though, is kind of, let's not talk about just technology. The policy mechanisms you have behind it or the business models you have harnessing it can be just as important as technology. It's technology and governance, technology and business. And across our cases, we saw a great diversity of different approaches to how these energy programs were being implemented. From the very standard, let's make the technology better, to very innovative things like stimulating end user demand with microfinance, or using cooperatives who jointly own the renewable energy systems themselves, like this project in Chintamekar, or fee-for-service models that look at energy services where you don't even own the solar panel. You'll pay a tariff that borrows the solar panel, and the company will maintain it, charge it, and make sure everything is working properly. You just pay a fee per month or per week. Or even very complex hybrid systems like those in Laos, where they cross-subsidized wealthy consumers to then fund energy poverty programs and then used an energy services company approach to implement those programs. And I think all of this underscores the social and political aspects of sustainable off-grid projects. This diagram comes from the World Bank, not known for being overly open to social factors, but even they are acknowledging that a sustainable project requires so many elements that are beyond the technology. Patterns of ownership, patterns of financing, patterns of community involvement, training, capacity building, access to repairs, and even things like good data will all feed it. And of course, having a project champion or a PMU. PMU is project management unit to help champion the project and overcome obstacles, because there are always obstacles that come up with these sort of projects. Or I like this one. This also comes from the World Bank, which kind of shows financing programs also need differentiated by need. There's a real concern that the kind of traditional cash and credit programs will only meet 20% of the market. 30% of the market will have to be met by very innovative microfinancing. And maybe 50% of the market is so risky from the bank standpoint, they won't even be eligible for loans or financing programs. It's the old adage that the banks always prefer to give money to those who don't need it. So in this case, there's a real concern that many of the world's most chronically energy poor are outside of the market, and they can only be accessed through social programs, social entrepreneurship, or direct assistance. They cannot afford energy. They don't have any assets. They not even have literacy or skills. And so this also really helps critique the kind of market-based approach that many development donors have sought over the past 30 or 40 years. That will invariably see hundreds of millions of vulnerable groups fall through the cracks. And then the third finding, this is the last one, although it's maybe the most complex, is that there are best practices in how you design these types of programs, or in the kind of factors behind the successes and the failures. Remember too, this is why we chose successes and failures when we identified our project. We wanted to see if the presence of certain variables correlated with success and the lack of those variables, or the inverse, correlated with failure. And to do this, it was quite complex. I said we were dealing with millions of words of text. And we basically, the research team sat around for 4 months analyzing all of the data and just inductively grouping together findings. And in the end, through this very iterative inductive process called qualitative factor analysis, we identified 12 lessons and 42 factors. 42, very nice. Those of you who like Douglas Adams may see a familiarity with that number. I assure you it was just coincidental. But yes, we identified 42 different factors that correlated with successful governance of off-grid energy programs. And you can see here an X indicates the presence of that factor, where the lack of an X indicates it's not there. And what you can see as we go down through these tables is lots of the successes have the X's and very few of the failures do. And these create lessons like focus not just on energy, but also things like jobs or quality of the technology, or explicitly trying to minimize greenhouse gas emissions alongside energy access programs. Make sure that you actually ask people what they want. Make sure that you focus on energy services rather than just the technology. Make sure you have high quality tech. Make sure you have culturally sensitive marketing and advertisements. For instance, in Grami and Shakti, men are not allowed into homes when the man is not there. And so Grami and Shakti trained only women. So they kind of culturally adapted to patterns of patriarchy to let women feel comfortable letting other women into their homes. Make sure that you don't give away projects for free. Make sure you have active community involvement, whether they're giving cash or savings or even non-monetary contributions like time or land or labor or in some case materials. One of the things that poor communities in Nepal did was give wood for the transmission lines to be built around their microhydro facilities. Make sure that you focus almost as much on awareness and after-sales service as selling the technology. Make sure that you train people how to put energy to productive use. Many of these people have never seen a light bulb before, so it's not intuitive to them how you put electricity to work. And many of the load factors for things like microhydro dams are below 20%, which means 80% of their energy is not being used because microhydro runs all day and all night. And so you can do things like teach them how to do shift work, where you can have grinding and husking and pumping at night and other tasks like lighting at night and other tasks during the day, so that you increase those load factors and maximize the productive use of energy. Make sure that you have a diverse number of stakeholders involved, not just government, and also not just members of the elite. Make sure that you focus on affordability so that you're ensuring these projects are reaching vulnerable groups and those at the lower deciles of income. Make sure that you're building lots of capacity, whether it's the capacity of government agencies to collect data or of entrepreneurs to learn how to do accounting, or even how to become self-sufficient so that when a program ends, it's not needed. And that's what's very striking about our successes, is that many of them explicitly set targets of where they would no longer need to exist. So they planned for their own obsolescence. And when those projects ended, very robust domestic markets were there that didn't need any type of support from that project anymore. Make sure that you are flexible in what you consider eligible. One of the big reasons the Papua New Guinea project failed is because it said there was only one type of panel that was eligible in one capacity, 50-watt peak panel. Communities didn't want that. They wanted a 10-watt peak or a 20-watt peak or a 100-watt peak, and they wanted solar lanterns and other devices. So that kind of hubris of World Bank and GEF presuming that they would want this particular panel completely backfired. Whereas in other cases, you let people choose from a diversity of eligible technologies and kind of set what they want themselves. Make sure that you do independent evaluation, make sure that you have penalties for those who break the rules, and make sure that you have an integration with policies and hopefully a project champion. Notice here that there was no project champion for all 4 of our failures, but we had a project champion. It was the Grameen Bank for Bangladesh. It was the REDP program for China. It was the Ministry of Energy for Laos. It was a Herders and Gers Association for Mongolia, and it was the Nepal Energy Authority for Nepal, and the Sustainable Energy Authority for Sri Lanka. So in each of those 6 cases, very strong institutions or people who are behind a successful project. So to conclude, for those of us that are more academic, this does remind us why energy access is such a challenging problem. It is one that is challenging our notions of scales, because it is involving end users and households and neighborhoods, but also kind of community councils and cooperatives and state planners, and also national regulations and even international flows of finance. It is multi-institutional, right? Cutting across all our dichotomies of consumers or suppliers or prosumers, energy supply and demand, even involvement of charities and faith-based groups and think tanks and inventors and innovators are all a part of this thriving network. It is a kind of domain of energy that goes well beyond electricity as well. It gets into agriculture and education and heat and other energy services. And it also gets into a multiplicity of energy uses. It's not just about cooking and lighting. It's about entertainment and luxury and income generation and productive uses and a whole broad array of other elements that cut beyond the technology. And I think while there are all of those compelling reasons to study energy access, maybe one of the most important gets to what Einstein said, and he said, not until we create and maintain decent conditions for all people, can we actually consider ourselves humanized? And I think in this way, you can also view energy access programs as our obligation and our responsibility to help lift others out of poverty, drudgery, and health insecurity. For those of you that want to follow up with kind of the data behind what we did, the projects here, the papers in red are the big three that came out of the project I mentioned. And I can't believe I almost forgot, it was funded graciously by the Rockefeller Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation. So thank you very much for supporting our work. We've continued to do some work later on post those projects. I've mentioned some of them here. We also have some in Africa, including Malawi, where we looked at the multifunctional program. So I'd be happy to share those as well. And if any of you want access to any of these studies, it really just kind of presents what I talked about in academic paper form. I'm always very, very happy to share. And with that, I'm very happy to open it up for questions. Thank you.